Good morning, one and all, and welcome to the main object Big Book study of Alcoholics Anonymous. I am an alcoholic. My name is David, and it is a blessing to be here with all of you again. And I have asked our friend Suki to be so kind as to help us get started by reading the AA preamble.
I'm Suki, I'm an alcoholic. AA Preamble. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of people who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other that they may solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self-supporting through our own contributions. AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution, does not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety.
Suki, thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank our friend Rich R for doing the hosting work today and posting stuff in the chat. So I appreciate that. And now, could you help me set the tone for the meeting and invite God into our discussion today by joining together in the Serenity Prayer? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. For those of you who may not have been here before, we are a line by line big book study. And so we move through the text in a more intensive way than you may find in a lot of AA Big Book meetings. So we literally focus on what we find is that by focusing on the minutia at times of how sentences were presented and how ideas were put forth, that we unlock the spiritual essence of the document that Bill was trying to put forth into the world. And one of the things that we do as well in order to help us grasp the text, and this is a way that I was shown as well, as we break it down into 5 main categories. And I use highlighters to help me understand what I'm looking at. And those categories are questions, directions and explanations, promises, warnings, and history. The colors you see there are highlighter colors that I arbitrarily chose for my own big book, and you can choose your own or use those. And then history, I just leave blank. But what this does is not only helps me grasp the deeper meaning of what is going on, what it does is it gives me a tool to share this with other people as I'm taking them through the book. And the other thing, so why we focus on this sort of, you could say, the minutia or the kind of the in-depth experience of the text, is what I find is that in so doing, it helps me have the spiritual experience from the book that I believe that the book was written in order to communicate. So today we are in Bill's story. We are on page 12. Our official start for today is that portion, the paragraph near the bottom where it says, "Thus I was convinced." But in order to set the stage and get a little context, we're going to back up just a little bit to set the tone. And I'm also I'll give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today, because we're at the point where Ebby has said to Bill, why don't you choose your own conception of God, which was like a lightning bolt for Bill. And at this point, what that allows, that realization, like Bill could choose his own concept. He's not bound by the notions of God that he was brought up with. That really creates the full impact and the meaning of Ebby's visit. And so when that hits him, it really opens a lot of doors in Bill's mind. And he makes a very passionate commitment to living a spiritual way of life. In that moment, he really does. And in so doing, he suddenly realizes that this is not the first time he has stood at this turning point. And when we read how it works, we often hear it read, we stood at the turning point. We asked his protection and care with complete abandon. And Bill is now at a turning point, but he also realizes, I have been at this place before. Now, just a side note, one of the things that we'll do, and I think this is probably the only time I'm going to do this, is we're actually going to go outside the basic text to understand the full meaning of that, because what we're going to do is look at the original manuscript. Because we talked about this recently in another meeting, in another Sunday, but Bill, when he wrote the original manuscript for his story, it was much longer. It was about twice the length. And it was edited down, not just for space and time, but there was this contingent in AA at the time that was worried that if a document was written, if a book was written that was too religious or spiritual, that it would turn people off. So some of the more religious aspects were pulled out. For the most part, we still get the message. However, when we talk about Bill's first spiritual awakening, that was actually taken out. So we're going to go back to that. And when we do, it really opens up what we're going to read today in a much different and a much bigger way. And I think it's an unfortunate omission, but I think by going back to it, we'll get the real meaning that Bill wanted to communicate to us. So, and that has to do with his visit to Winchester Cathedral when he was a soldier in World War I. Bill has this awakening. He has this realization that he's been here before, but he still needs hospitalization to deal with the physical impact of his drinking, because he's been drinking pretty straight now for at least 2 weeks, if not 3 weeks. And so he has been on an extended drunk. So he needs to be detoxed, and he needs some medical attention to be sure that he doesn't go into the DTs. So he goes to the hospital, and the visit really marks Bill's, what he calls, final separation from alcohol and the beginning of his spiritual way of living. Ebby visits Bill at the hospital, at Town's Hospital, and leads him through what would soon become the 12 steps. That's going to be the bulk of our conversation today, is this first initial dive into the 12-step process. And this process makes it clear to Bill that ongoing reliance on God and the destruction of self-centeredness are essential for ongoing sobriety. And so we are at the bottom of page 12. Thus I was convinced. And that first sentence I have highlighted in blue as a promise. Thus I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. And what Bill is realizing is that he had been wanting God to perform for him, to prove to him his existence, when Bill's real commitment to God was indifferent at best. And what he is realizing now was he didn't have a genuine desire for God. And we'll see that in a big way in a moment. The next sentence is, I see it as a piece of direction. At long last, I saw, I felt, I believed. I saw, meaning that he was able to perceive God. He felt it, and that it moved into his heart, and then it moved into his mind. So what he's talking about is that this experience of God now worked for him on multiple levels. It just wasn't an idea. Up until this point, God was an idea he was wrestling with. Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. A new world came into view. I have that in blue as a promise. Now, we could spend, and we're not going to do this, okay, so don't worry, but we could really spend a whole meeting just talking about that sentence or even the paragraph. We're not going to do that. But I read that sentence for years, not really understanding what Bill was saying. First of all, scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. The notion, I'm going to stop everything for a second and offer a pop quiz. Anyone want to venture a guess or know where the phrase scales fell from the eyes, where that came from? Kathy, you want to answer?
I'm pointing to Donna. I suspect the Bible.
It is from the Bible.
Was it the conversion of Paul?
Yeah.
It is. It
There
is
you
the
go.
story.
Put the sand on his eyes.
Thank you. Very good. Very good. So we had there's our Sunday school lesson. It is a biblical metaphor. It comes from specifically Acts, the book of Acts, 9, I believe 18. And what it has to do with the story and I think it's important to go into for a minute, because Bill is, first of all, he is compounding the notion of having a spiritual experience, being touched by God or being touched by a divine presence. Very briefly, the story is Saul is someone who, he is not a Christian. He persecutes Christians. He kills Christians because it was being a Christian at the time was very it was illegal, and he is on the road to Damascus, and Jesus, who has been crucified, suddenly appears to him and basically says to him, "Why are you giving me and my people such a hard time?" And Saul doesn't know what to say. And the light from Jesus is so overwhelming, it blinds him. A passerby finds Saul, this is the distinction's important, and brings him home, nurses him back to health, prays over him, and then suddenly Saul's sight is restored. He can see now. I was blind, now I can see. He immediately converts to Christianity, changes his name, or his name is changed to Paul, and he founds the Catholic Church. And he becomes St. Paul, who we know today as St. Paul. So when Bill says, scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes, a new world came into view, what Bill is saying, he is saying that pride and prejudice, now I have this in the notes, pride, an undue sense of superiority, and prejudice, which is prejudgment without evidence. And where have we heard the phrase contempt prior to investigation? So that's the notion. There are some people, some big book commentators who will sometimes say prejudice just means old ideas. I'm not disputing that, but I think it's a little bit more specific than that. Because what Bill is linking it to is character defect. And remember, elsewhere in the text, they talk about, Bill says, putting aside the drink question, they talk about why living was such hard going for them. What Bill is doing right now is he's saying, what made my life difficult? He is seeing what made my life difficult was not alcohol. It was pride and it was prejudice. And the drinking was a result or a consequence of the underlying character defect. So Bill was touched by God. The scales leave his eyes. A new world comes into view. The real significance, and that is a promise. These next several sentences are promises as well. The real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst upon me. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. I need to pause for a second. When Bill says in that first sentence, the real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst upon me. If you do not know, and most people, who would know the original draft of Bill's story? Practically no one. So if you don't know that, you're assuming what he means is the significance of the Hampshire Grenadier tombstone. But that's not what he means. What he means is something entirely different than that. And let's do this. I have it right here. This is from Bill's original manuscript. Okay? Bear in mind he is in England getting ready to go over to France to fight in World War I. Right up here, this is from the original manuscript. We were in England. I stood in Winchester Cathedral with head bowed in the presence of something I never felt before. So he's feeling this vibe in Winchester Cathedral. Where now was the God of the preachers? Across the channel, thousands were perishing that day. Why did he not come? Basically, he's angry at God for allowing this war to happen and allowing people to suffer. Suddenly, so he's saying, God, where are you? Suddenly, in that moment of darkness, he was there. I felt an enveloping, comforting presence. Tears stood in my eyes. I had glimpsed the great reality. Bill has a spiritual awakening right there in Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered through the cathedral yard. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. Now we're back to the piece we're familiar with. Here lies a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold, small beer. A good soldier is ne'er forgot, whether he dieth by musket or by pot. We're all familiar with that. However, look at this next part. My mood changed. A squadron of fighters roared overhead. I cried to myself, here's to adventure. Remember, Bill wanted adventure. He wanted significance. He wanted to make a mark in the world. He wanted to be the #1 man. That feeling of being in the great presence disappeared. What Bill is saying is, I was in the presence of God. I was given a choice. What I chose instead of God was I chose adventure. I chose personal acclaim. So when we go back and we read, the real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst upon me, that's what he is talking about, not the tombstone. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. He had a sincere desire to have union with God. And he had a moment where, as he says, there had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. And per the 1939 dictionary, I wanted to make sure I wasn't making assumptions about the word humble. And in 1939, humble was taken to mean submissive. So he was willing to submit to God. And he came. Now, all of that up to this point is promise. This next part, though, is a warning in pink. But soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by worldly clamors, mostly those within myself. And so it had been ever since. How blind I had been. Blinded by what, folks? Scales of pride and prejudice. Bill's underlying character defect. So Bill is saying, I've been at this turning point before. The last time, have you ever had a choice? An important choice, and you screwed it up? Anybody? Just me? And then you're presented with that choice again in the future? And you think, hold it, I screwed it up last time. I'm going to go, I turned left before, I'm turning right this time. That's exactly what happens to Bill here. Moving on. At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. This is a promise. I think as Bill is structuring it, Bill's not making a decision here. This is a result of what came before it. That willingness to have union with God. Also, if you notice, if you like me had a rather tough fifth grade grade school English teacher, it would have been pointed out to me, if I would have written that sentence, I would have been told, David, that's a bad sentence. That is a passive structure. And what's that mean? That means when you write, in writing, you want active structure, which means the person writing or the subject of the writing wants to be the one taking the action. And that is a passive structure. Bill's not saying he separated himself from alcohol. See, and my point being that the passive structure there is purposeful. He wants a passive structure because he wants to communicate the idea, gang, I didn't do this. It was done for me. At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. Most of this next paragraph is green. I put it in green for direction. The very last sentence here, just to jump ahead, is a promise, but the rest of it, 90% of it, is direction. Okay. There I humbly, he's at the hospital. There I humbly offered myself to God, as I then understood him. Humbly, submissively. God, I am here to serve you. He's not saying, as we sometimes hear, God, save me from this torture of alcoholism. He's not saying that. He's saying, God, I want to bond with you to serve you. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. That word unreservedly is important because what it means. This is great. I used to envision myself a wine connoisseur. Anybody else? Any former wine connoisseurs? Remember hearing the phrase, like 1985 reserve, special reserve shipment. He's not using it because of alcohol. He's using it to mean something else. But reserve, the thing is, reserve means to hold some. That means that 1985, when all the other wine went out, they held some back for later. Ever hold back some alcohol for later? I did that a lot, except it was usually your alcohol that I was holding back for later. That's another story. I placed myself, but what he's saying here, jokes aside, I placed myself unreservedly in his care, meaning I placed myself without holding anything back for later, without saying, well, you never know what's going to come down the pike. I'm doing okay now. He's saying holding nothing back for later. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. What we have there, ladies and gentlemen, he's not using this term, but that is step 3. Bill takes step 3 in the hospital. Now, up to this point, and we could go back and point out the sections, but the assumption is, and we've seen it, that Bill has already taken steps 1 and 2. And now he has taken 3. And so those first couple sentences are Bill taking step 3. These next few sentences in this paragraph are a combination of steps 4, 6, and 7. I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have my newfound friend, capital F friend, take them away, root and branch. I have not had a drink since. That last sentence is a promise. It's a result. And the implication is very clear there. His freedom from alcohol is a result of his spiritual activity, not a mental or a willful effort or decision. It's a result of a spiritual relationships. Also,
what did you say that was a combination of which steps?
4, 6, and 7.
Thank you.
Yes. I have not had a drink since. Also, just a side note, but this is important. My newfound friend took them away root and branch. The branch is what we see with our eyes. It's what's obvious to everybody. The roots are where it springs from, but where are roots? Roots are below the surface. They cannot be readily seen. That metaphor is critical when we are doing steps 4 and 5. Causes, and in elsewhere he's going to call it causes and conditions. The next sentence is step 5. My schoolmate visited me, and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. And of course, he means Ebby there. Step 5. The rest of the paragraph, and the whole paragraph is direction, all in green for me. That first sentence is step 5. The rest of the paragraph. We have a combination again. Steps 4 and 8. He's taking stock inventory, and also he's alluding, he doesn't explicitly do this, but what he's alluding to is step 9, the amends step. So I actually even put step 9 in parentheses. So we made a list of people I had hurt or toward whom I felt resentment. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrong. Clearly, step 8. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to right all such matters to the utmost of my ability. So he's sort of forecasting step 9 there. The next paragraph and the first sentence are more direction. This is another critical paragraph in terms of his spiritual relationship. I was to test my thinking by the new... let me back up. The entire paragraph is step 11. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. And that is direction. The next sentence, I sort of saw it as a promise. You could see it as a promise, as direction. It really, it's somewhere along those lines. It took me a while to really untangle this sentence. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense. So what's he saying there? He is saying that by testing my thinking by the new God consciousness, I would receive inspired solutions, common sense, which are common solutions or common thinking, would be transformed into inspired solutions. Uncommon sense, I looked it up. It does not mean, and there's a link in the chat that you can go to. It does not mean smart thinking would be replaced by dumb thinking. It doesn't mean that. It means that the traditional answers would be replaced by more valuable yet more rare solutions and thinking. So moving on, I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. And again, there is so much we could say about what's happening there. Because remember, this is the guy who envisioned himself as Napoleon, who was trying to overtake Walter Hagen, who had to be the number one man. And suddenly, he is going to be open and vulnerable in the face of God when he is in doubt. The old Bill Wilson, I perceive, may not have even admitted doubt or to have doubt, but he was going to use that now as a gateway to spiritual connection. And he's asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. So he's asking for an inspiration and then the strength, the willingness to move forward in all that. I don't know about anybody else here, but for myself, this is an incredible lesson in not just humility, but fortitude, the strength of will to focus on this and want this and pursue this sort of humble reliance upon a divine creator. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my requests bore on my usefulness to others. And again, he's talking the very essence of what is step 11. And then, and that all that I just read there is, that is direction. So I have it in green. But these last two sentences in this paragraph are promises. Then only might I expect to receive. I guess you could call that direction in terms of gauging your expectation. But I see that actually, that expectation, I see that coming as a gift, as a reward. But that would be in great measure, again, another promise there. So a totally different relationship with this idea of what your place in the world is, what your relationship is to the world around you, and of course what your relationship is with God. My friend, and now that's lowercase f, so of course here he is meaning Ebby. My friend promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator. I think that's pretty evident at this point, and that is a promise. Actually, one of the few sentences that actually points out that it's a promise, because Ebby promised that I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems. And again, another promise there. And those, well, that's actually, it's one sentence, long sentence, compound sentence. And what we see there is step 12. It's the essence of step 12. So with the previous paragraph, we saw step 11 taking shape, and now we're seeing step 12 taking shape. A new relationship with the Creator, meaning having had a spiritual awakening as a result of this process. And then I would have the elements of a way of living with which answered all my problems. We practice these principles in all our affairs. And then now this next sentence over to the end of the paragraph is more direction. Belief in the power of God plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things were the essential requirements. So one of the things that Bill is pointing out is that this way of life, it's not just this magical gift that we are given and then can sort of automatically fall into. it's not something that just hits us from being without alcohol and without drinking and going to meetings. It is something we must actively pursue and cultivate as a spiritual obligation to our higher power and the people around us. Now, believe me, going to meetings, especially meetings that follow the literature, certainly makes that process a bit easier. But this is, it requires effort. And then finishing up the next paragraph, which is all direction again, so I have that in green. Simple, but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. That's a very different relationship. The Father of light. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. That's a very different relationship to it's a very different understanding of a higher power, first of all, and then a very different relationship with that higher power. Very different than what Bill was advocating for himself just a few paragraphs before, which we assume was just a few days before when he came into this. And then the Father of this notion of the Father of light. And in this sense, you could say an authoritative figure who I am submissive to, who presides over us all. And what Bill is also saying, I'm going to extrapolate that just a tiny bit further, is that without surrendering our own self-authority, if we continue to run our own lives, even with a better set of morals and ideals and goals, if we continue to run our own life, we are doomed to darkness. And we are likely doomed to drink again. So I must turn in all things to the Father of light. I must surrender to the Father of light who presides over us all. And with that, I'll stop there, and now we can open it up. And I'd love to hear what we've covered. A lot of ground today. I'd love to hear what you think of this.